person with this interesting VPN phone number, right? Because it says New Mexico whenever I call
Yes, it's Google Voice, which is not allowed in Canada, but I have a workaround. So, yeah.
Yeah, cool. No, those are handy though.
It is.
Yeah. So, I imagine you're quite busy, but I just thought, like, am I taking crazy pills or something? Because it's been a month, and Public Health Ontario, I've been asking them weekly, and they don't want to take a side on this. But it is the law of the land here.
On the isolation period, it's
yeah,
it's weird. It's weird. So, we seem to be following what the CDC does. And CDC had shortened their isolation period to 5 days. CDC doesn't distinguish between vaccinated and unvaccinated, which is a mistake. At least Ontario does that. The problem is that they're basing this on old pre-Omicron data, where previous studies suggested that the peak transmission period was 2 days before symptoms and 3 days afterwards. That gives you like 5 days, more or less. The problem is that we don't have similar data for Omicron. So there is a Japanese study that made the waves recently, and I think it's a preprint, but it showed that with Omicron, peak infectiousness is 3 to 6 days after symptoms arise. So that suggests that if you're isolating for 5 days, then for a lot of people, when you return to society, that's when your peak infectiousness actually is. So the guidance doesn't seem to be in accordance or aligned with the most recent information on Omicron. Now, this all is meaningless if you've got testing to get you out of isolation. It's only relevant if you haven't got testing. So if you've got testing, then it really doesn't matter how long the isolation period is. You can reduce it down to 3 or 4 days. If you have no symptoms and you have 2 negative rapid tests 24 hours apart, then the confidence that you are not infectious is quite high. Because what we care about here is infectiousness. We don't really care that much about infectedness. You can be infected, and if you got no symptoms and you're not infectious, go about your business. So, but if you're virally shedding sufficient quantities to infect others, that's when we want you to isolate. So, so the confounder here is, can you test? If you can test, doesn't matter. If you can't test, what is the appropriate length of time? Strikes me that 10 days still makes sense.
Okay. Now, in your assessment, the vast majority of Ontarians either don't have access to rapid tests or don't fall into the PCR eligibility.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So what I think we should be doing is reserving rapid test capacity to get workers back to work. So we shouldn't be using rapid tests to, see if you're safe to go to that party or whatever, which is how some people are using it. We should be using it to get people who cannot work from home back into their jobs, and probably to do surveillance in daycares as well, any place where vaccination is not available. Now, ideally, we should be purchasing as many rapid tests as we can on the open market and making them freely available to all Ontarians. And the Americans seem to have a lot of supply, so I'm not sure why we can't get any. But in absence of that happening quickly, then reserve the testing capacity you do have for this reason. Now, let's assume you have no testing. What do you do then? Then I think you have to default to the 10-day isolation, with the exception of if you've got an extended period of no symptoms whatsoever, then your probability of being infectious diminishes. I'm not sure by how much it diminishes.
Right.
The problem here, of course, is the economic argument is you can't have that many people off work for 10 days, and I understand that. So you have to balance the public health concerns with the economic concerns. I'm not sure what the appropriate tipping point there is. But if you really had to err on the side of getting as many people back to work as possible, then look at the symptomatic status to help guide that length of time.
But from your assessment and with the latest emerging information, this 5 days business without testing is not great.
That's not great. Imagine if you are sitting on the bus next to someone who got out of isolation 5 days later with no testing. Would you feel comfortable sitting next to that person? Probably not, because you don't know if they're still infectious. They don't know if they're still infectious. And frankly, why the isolation in the first place? The assumption is they were infected. And that's another story entirely. Did they get a positive test to confirm their infection, or they simply had an exposure or have symptoms. So, yeah,
Yeah,
it's not an ideal scenario.
definitely. So the other thing I was going to ask, and this isn't necessarily what I'm writing today, but my team and I have been talking about it a lot, like with the PCR levels down, there seems to be, if public health bureaucrats are to be believed, a whole bunch of excess capacity now available each day, like somewhere between 40 and 60,000 tests a day. That's if they're telling the truth, right? Like they claim 78,000 a day. I've never seen that. They still insist it's the case.
Right.
But if we're down to 20 or 30,000 a day, like you mentioned, daycares, surveillance, like there's a whole bunch of places we should start be devoting this to, right?
We could be. Now, the problem with PCR, it's just so incredibly sensitive that you can detect an infected person who is not a threat to others because either they're really early in the infectious process or they're really late in their infection cycle, in which case they're no longer infectious. What we care about is infectiousness. So the PCR capacity has to be married with something called the cycle threshold. That's the number of cycles the thing was run to detect the viral RNA. And I don't know what the right cutoff is, but you establish a cutoff number for viral load, and we use that for surveillance purposes of who's likely infectious at a given time. But again, this capacity can be used to get people out of isolation, with the caveat that, but you got to have a negative PCR test before you go back to work. Okay, a negative PCR test with a cycle threshold below a certain. Or a positive PCR threshold above a certain number.
So I'm somewhat familiar. I know that the province says positive is anything below 35 CT.
Okay, that makes sense.
You would drop that?
No, it makes sense. I'm not a lab guy. I don't know what the appropriate cutoff is, but if they're having that CT conversation, that's good enough for me. It means they're aware that there's a distinction there, so that's good.
Okay. Right, but you're basically saying if used in the right way.
Yes, if used in the right way. Right.
Yeah, it could help the problem.
I think all testing capacity at this point should be prioritized to get people back to work.
Okay. All right, Doc, thanks so much for giving me some time. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.